Hi, Jason. Welcome to our first Soundly Said podcast. We're so excited to have you with us today.
Thanks so much for having me here. I'm so excited to be able to chat with you all.
So, we wanted to start off questions by asking you, what is the rule of law?
Great. I think to unpack that question, we need to begin by thinking a little bit about what law is and what the foundation of it is. Because unlike a natural phenomenon, like a scientific fact, it's something that's entirely constructed by people. It's a social set of rules that helps to dictate how we should act and how we shouldn't act. And in contrast to the rule of law, what we see is the rule of man. Power being the primary deciding force on what you have to do. But in contrast to that, the rule of law is when we respect the legal system and the rules that apply to us all equally, such that we are all equally able to be constrained and also guided by the legal system around us. So the rule of law is really the idea that the set of customs and norms embedded in the legal system and its enforcement are genuinely respected, and that is the way that we are able to adjudicate the most consequential and important disputes within our society.
So, as a follow up, what are the necessary conditions for a healthy rule of law?
So the rule of law is marked by the fact that it is consistent, that we can have transparency, and that applies to everybody equally. So we need to make sure that the rule of law is actually equally applied. Obviously, you can respect the legal system in a country, but if the rules in and of themselves are illegitimate, unjust, differentially applied, that would obviously be one significant failing of the rule of law. That it might have the force of being able to dictate and guide us, but of course, we also want the rule of law to be legitimate in some sort of way. And the other part that I alluded to there is that the rule of law has genuine power, that people believe in the rule of law. So, what does that actually look like in a governmental system? It means that the executive abides by the limits that the judicial system puts upon it, that a president or a prime minister actually has to be held accountable to the legal system and how it operates. It means that legislators, when constructing laws, actually have to think about the constraints provided by the legal system. Supreme Court rulings or other judgments that indicate that certain laws are legitimate and certain laws aren't legitimate. And of course, the cornerstone of it all, past just the courts, it is the foundational legal documents that a nation might have. A written constitution that prescribes what the general values of that state are and what should be protected. Or even in some cases, in places like Israel or the UK, an unwritten constitution, a set of basic fundamental legal rules and legal rights that ultimately end up ensuring that courts are able to protect people's rights and that can constrain the power of government, whether it be the executive or the legislative branch.
So, as another follow up, why do you think the rule of law is so important, both ethically and practically? And can you please give us some real life examples?
Absolutely. So let's start off by looking at some of the practical examples here. The rule of law is very, very important because it helps to ensure that investors, people, anyone really, feels like they know what is going on and they can rely on the rules that have been set out. So let's imagine, for instance, that you want to invest into a country. You want to help build a factory. You want to build a business there, whatever it might be. The rule of law, when it is evenly applied, when it is actually legitimately followed, and when it constrains the power of the executive, it provides those investors a stable set of guidelines to know how their investment will go. For instance, a country may say, we're not allowed to nationalize a country unless there are very specific circumstances or conditions. And that's important because if you're an investor and you know that that is the rule, you know that it will be maintained, then you might be more willing to invest because you know your property can't be seized by you. In contrast, we can see examples, obviously, where that has been undermined. So, for instance, when Mexico nationalized American oil in Mexico itself. And that has a ripple effect where nations cannot trust that country anymore. So that even application of the rule of law is so important for people to do business, to do commerce. The rule of law is important for how regular people are able to make their own decisions in life. If I know what rules are applied upon me, what the guidelines are, I can make better decisions. Trivial example here. Imagine that you're in a car, you're driving, knowing that the speed limit is 50 kilometers an hour, that is a legitimate rule, that it can't be interpreted or abused by any authority to try and put you in prison when you don't deserve to be put in prison. That means that you know you can drive at 50 kilometers an hour. And while that seems small scale, almost every single decision that we make in our lives that regards the legal system in some way, it could be affected if we didn't have a stable or legitimate or consistent rule of law. So on a practical level, I think it's very, very important for economic development for people to be able to make reliable and consistent decisions. If we're looking at this from a more ethical level, the rule of law is really what dictates the relationship between government and its citizenry. All citizens deserve some right to be able to influence the state, and the legal system and its legislation is part of that. That when citizens are able to actually influence legislators to pass a policy, they know that that rule will be consistently applied. It's a way of guaranteeing that any legislative system, any legal system, has some degree of teeth to it. But I think past that, the rule of law is really about your autonomy. Because, as I already mentioned, if you don't know how the law is going to be applied, how do you know how to live your life? If you don't know what sorts of rules are going to be applied upon you, what sort of ability do you have to make any genuine choice with full information and a full awareness of what the consequences are? So, the rule of law is a fundamental way in which we design and construct the relationship between citizens and the government, private businesses and the government. Constrains the government's power, and it helps to ensure that people can feel safe in the decisions that they're making.
All right, thank you so much for that. I'd like to pass it off to Connie to continue with more in-depth questions.
Thank you, Serena. I think the natural question that follows from the importance of the rule of law is how do we as citizens evaluate the performance of our own legal institutions?
So, one of the important things that we need to understand about this is at a baseline, when we're evaluating the performance of any legal system, we do need to have some degree of knowledge. And I just mentioned this and caution people on this because I think very frequently people try to evaluate the legal system without having a prerequisite understanding of how the law works and whether or not it's being evenly applied. Now, assuming that we have full knowledge, full understanding of how the legal system operates and how it works, the way that we assess the rule of law would be as follows. First, do the rules get consistently applied between everybody? This is the idea of justice being blind, that regardless of your race, your ethnicity, your creed, your gender, that you still have equal representation and protection from the legal system. And if the legal system is applied improperly or selectively, that inherently violates the purpose of the rule of law because, as already mentioned, the rule of law is about being able to ensure that people can make decisions and they know what rules they can rely upon and that they don't have to feel as if arbitrary power will end up dictating how they are treated. But when the rules are selectively applied, that is an example of arbitrary application based not on whether or not you fell within these legal requirements or whether or not you committed a crime, but instead on the subjective whims of a politician, perhaps, or of a prosecutor who has political ends. Now, past that, the next thing that we want to think about when we're evaluating the rule of law is how much it is respected and enforced. That when the court makes a decision, does the executive and the legislature follow in turn? Most often it is the executive that is relevant here because they control the military, the police, administrative agencies who apply different statutes. But the key thing here is that there's a faithful application of that rule, that legislation, and that ultimately you can rely on other institutions to validate the rule of law. Now, the contrast is when you get backsliding, when the rule of law is violated, when people end up thinking, actually, it's not that important to follow these rules. And we can most emblematically see that in circumstances when constitutions are suspended, when emergency powers are being used, when the courts are being disregarded entirely. And that could look like a wide variety of different countries. It could be El Salvador, for instance, that has issues with judicial independence. Some would argue that could be Singapore, where oftentimes there are some politically motivated prosecutions. In Malaysia, where political opponents are attacked simply to be able to erode the ability for an opposition party to mount an effective opposition. And that would be how you can see when the rule of law is really falling apart and it doesn't operate as it should.
Now, is there a particular legal case or precedent where you think these criterion really allow us to evaluate whether or not we have a strong rule of law or a weak one?
Absolutely. Let's talk about an important case in the UK for this. So, in constitutional law, we learn about this case called Anasminic, and it's an essential case for dictating the rule of law and the relationship between the courts and the government. So, I'll give you the situation. So, in essence, what had happened was the British government were trying to illegally reclaim property in Egypt from the Suez Canal after a dispute between the Egyptian government and the British government. Now, in this case, the government put a portion of their legislation as an ouster clause. So what that basically means is they had this section that said, the legal system isn't allowed to assess whether or not this legislation is illegal or not. So they were essentially trying to evade court supervision. And so the case comes to the government, or to that legal system, to the Supreme Court of the UK. And in their decision, the Supreme Court of the UK ends up arguing that it is illegitimate for the government to apply an ouster clause such that the legislation cannot be reviewed and cannot be challenged by the judicial system. Now, there's many specific justifications with this case that relate to British legal principles like parliamentary sovereignty. And I'm not going to talk about that in-depth legal justification too much here. But what I think it exemplifies is this idea that the legal system must be a supervisor for any decision that the government makes. That the government cannot evade legal accountability or the checks and balances that have been built into our systems, and the fact that it was respected, the fact that the ouster clause was removed and that the legislation could be reviewed and had to be altered, all of that is so important for being able to establish the supremacy of law. Again, the rule of law, not the rule of man, like people who run the government at the time, those who are rich, those who are politically connected, etc. So that's an excellent example of a case that really helps to validate the idea of the rule of law.
Thank you. I know that we've talked a bit about how the rule of law can lead to faith in legal institutions, but let's zoom in on that a little bit. Are there cases where you think that there is a disconnect between the perception of the rule of law and how it is in reality?
Absolutely. One of the things that we see all around the world today, especially with the trend of democratic backsliding, is that there are accusations that the institutions around us are corrupt, that they're unjust. I think this is a foundational part of the rise of populism that we see all across the world. A distrust of the elites, a distrust of the institutions that govern people. And so I think we live in an era where there is widespread distrust in the legal system, a genuine belief that it is being selectively used in illegitimate or improper ways. Now, here, the really important thing to note is, of course, the legal system could be just fine. That when there's a case that you disagree with, there's actually a legitimate legal reason, but you can't understand that legal reasoning. That's very frequently where we see this divergence, where politics intersects with law, and there's some kind of political group who has an incentive to undermine the legitimacy of decisions that are being made by the legal system itself. And of course, there are cases where indeed the rule of law is being infringed upon. So yes, maybe we're misinformed, but there are plenty of circumstances where we can see that the rule of law is being infringed upon and people understand that. There isn't a huge perception gap. So for instance, I think the federal government of the US at points seeming to ignore verdicts made by courts, that I think is a strong indication that certain segments of the world are becoming less responsive to the rule of law.
And I know this might seem a little obvious, but I just wanted to ask, how do you think social media and online spaces have exacerbated this disconnect between the public's perception of the rule of law and how legal cases are actually going through the courts?
Oh, immensely. There's no doubt that the way that social media and its algorithm works naturally distorts information and makes us less well aware of what's happening in the world around us. There's this concept of algorithmic radicalization. I'm not sure if you have heard of it, but I think in essence, the idea of it is that when you engage with content on social media, they want you to engage with it more. They want you to be addicted so they make as much ad revenue as possible. And one of the ways to do that is to make you really passionate. And when we talk about politics, that often means making you very, very left wing or very, very right wing, to be on the extreme ends of the spectrum where misinformation thrives. And so social media wants you to become more addicted. They have their powerful algorithm with millions of different data points to be able to figure out how to gradually radicalize you over time. And ultimately, that's what leads to fake news or misinformation or a lack of understanding. That's what leads to things like, for instance, QAnon, these massive conspiracy theories that say that the Democrats are a lizard people who are ultimately running illegal operations under a pizza joint in some random state in the US. So social media has done this with the legal system as well. There are numerous cases where I think social media misconstrues what is moral versus what is legal. That someone can be legally exculpated for something, but we may still think that their behavior in other ways was illegitimate. The classic example I would give here is actually of Kyle Rittenhouse. Kyle Rittenhouse was a man who was accused of murdering two people during the BLM protests in 2020. And he did some bad things along the way. So he brought a gun across state lines, even though he wasn't a registered gun owner, even though it was illegal to bring a gun across state lines. And he killed two people, but the facts of the case found that it was in self-defense. They were attacking him. And people misconstrue this. They think, well, look, isn't he guilty because he obviously went to the protests with the intention of killing somebody? But that's not relevant for self-defense. All self-defense really cares about is whether or not in that moment you are in imminent danger. Now, it is certainly fair to say it might be wrong or unethical for him to have brought the gun over state lines, that he might have had the intention to hurt somebody, but legally speaking, he was in the clear. And so I think this is where misinformation is most rife when we talk about the legal system. When people fail to understand the distinction between the legal rules, the rule of law, and ethics. Because some laws are not necessarily the most ethical laws. We know this from all around the world where we have unjust regimes. And of course, sometimes what is moral is not codified in the law. You can think about adultery as a good example of that.
Okay, thank you. I think this conversation about modern misinformation transitions us nicely to a more general discussion about what happens when the faith in the rule of law is eroded. How do people and societies more broadly change their behavior as a result of that?
Absolutely. So this is very topical given how much the rule of law and the faith in it has eroded across the world. Now, it's all a question of how much it's been eroded and over what sorts of issues. Because very rarely is the erosion of the rule of law overnight, that you go from a functional legal system that governs what people do to nothing in a day. What's much more likely is that components of the rule of law are peeled back, that the administrative or the executive branch don't listen to the judiciary as often or on certain legal judgments or decisions, although they may respect other legal verdicts and judgments. And I think the dangerous thing about the rule of law being eroded is that on a day-to-day basis for a regular citizen, it doesn't seem like that much has changed. From one month to the next, you feel as if, well, some policies are being passed even without the consent of the judiciary, but lots of people will support those policies. That's why those policies are even being passed in the first place. But over time, the erosion of the rule of law is really about the removal of accountability. And so what starts off as small changes, which don't really change people's behavior, can quickly slide into a systematic approach to democratic backsliding, undermining the constitutional norms and values and legal norms and values that uphold the way that we live our lives. And very quickly then, what matters is power. In a society where the rule of law has truly been eroded, what matters is whether or not that police officer likes you. You have to pay bribes so that he doesn't send you to prison or make up some false trumped up charge because there's no real accountability for him. What matters is what that politician thinks and whether or not they want to sick their political hacks at you and engage in political prosecution. And very quickly, what these societies devolve into is a society where people appeal to authority and power, where what matters are not the consistent rules that are applied or even what is ethical, but instead what helps to ensure that you aren't arbitrarily hurt by a system that can be so easily twisted into arbitrary abuse.
Thank you so much for your time and your answers, Jason. I'm now going to pass it on to Zach.
Hello, Jason. It's great to have
Hi,
you here today.
thank you so
So,
much.
off of the past few questions, we've discussed how faith in the rule of law tends to erode, but even when you have a legal system that is perfect on paper, that doesn't mean people buy into it. You can have a perfect rule of law where it is applied justly, but the laws themselves are illegitimate. So, how do we ensure that people trust the legal system beyond just applying the laws as they are meant to be applied?
Absolutely. I think here to consider this, we want to think a little bit about how most governments gain their legitimacy, not just the judicial system, but the entirety of the government as a whole. So, when we think about the legitimacy of a government, we can break it down into two different sources of legitimacy. We have input legitimacy and output legitimacy. Input legitimacy is all about the identity of those who are making decisions. So, for instance, back in the medieval ages, if you were the king, you got to make all the decisions because you had input legitimacy. There is something about you as a decision maker that gave you credibility, that gave you credence. The contrast is, of course, output legitimacy. Governments that are able to maintain legitimacy amongst the people by primarily passing good laws that uphold people's rights or that betters their lives or that makes people satisfied with the government's performance as a whole. And broadly speaking, that's what the rule of law needs to be able to maintain as well. It needs to make sure that either people respect the pedigree of the decision makers, that they respect democratic institutions and traditions, that they care about having legislators who are able to pass laws that the administrative branch then follows and that the judicial branch can then supervise. Some kind of faith in democratic tradition, some value of democratic decision making, some ability for people to have influence over and feel like it is fair, those are all things that help to ensure that people respect the rule of law. And of course, when the rule of law delivers good outcomes for people, that is another thing that can uphold the rule of law. But I'll point out, sometimes good outcomes are just for the majority. So the rule of law can be believed in by a substantial group of society, but the laws can still be deeply unjust. Imagine a society that has an ethnic majority of 80% and an ethnic minority of 20%. Maybe India is a good example with the divide between Hindus and Muslims. And the problem is people broadly can support the rule of law, can believe in it, but it can still end up harming Muslims unjustly and disproportionately applying laws to them, and still at the same time be viewed as legitimate by the people. So I think to tie this all together, in order to ensure that people have a faith in the rule of law, what we need is those basic requirements, some input legitimacy, some output legitimacy. But in reality, these systems can still be deeply, deeply flawed. And even if the majority of the population supports it and affirms it, there might be a sizable minority who is discriminated against, who doesn't actually get fair treatment, and who ultimately is cast to this wayside because of how our governments and societies are constructed.
Now, I think your answer to that last question sort of partially answers what I'm about to ask you. But is the definition of a just law something that is objective, or is it something that a populace has the right to self-determine? Now, I know there are diverse perspectives on this, so I would appreciate if you could run us through them and explain which one you personally align with, though I'm getting a sense where you tend to lean.
Absolutely. So I think that there's actually a wide spectrum of different laws, and that some of them fit more neatly into one box versus another. There are some laws that I think we could unequivocally say are good laws, that we could objectively say are valuable and important. Your basic right to life is obviously very important. So all the laws that we have to protect people's basic right to life, objectively good. Anything that prohibits murder, for instance, which every country in the world has, That ensures that we have some objectively beneficial outcome. But there are also laws that are in the middle, that are in gray zones, because there are some values or some things of importance that are mostly constructed by society and its values. Let me give you an example of this. So, most people, when they study philosophy, hear about this idea of harm principle by John Stuart Mill. The idea that if something hurts somebody else, then we should be able to outlaw it. But those are the only things that we should outlaw. People should have freedom to do whatever they want. But in almost every society, we also recognize that sometimes things that are offensive can be outlawed. Think about public nudity. If someone was naked outside of your house or your apartment, there isn't any physical, tangible harm that's been done to you, but many people are certainly offended and they would want to ban that. Now, here's the point that I'm trying to get at. In this case, each society can determine what is sufficiently offensive and choose to ban it. Of course, there are constraints. Maybe there are other rights that limit this. For instance, maybe you're not allowed to ban the ability for gay couples to hold hands because that violates the Constitution in some other way. But there are certainly some cases where the thing that we're banning because it's offensive is almost entirely on the basis that we have certain social values and, of course, on the fact that it doesn't violate any other constitutional rights or anything of the sort. And so I would say there's a whole set of laws where it is permissible for you to set them, but only if you have the consent of the governed, only if the democratic polity and society as a whole determines that that is legitimate.
Now, let's say we're inventing a country, the Republic of Jasonland. What rights would you make pre-political? What things would you not allow the governed to consent their rights away?
Absolutely. So the first thing that you always need to enshrine in any government system are the procedural rights, the right to a fair trial, the right to vote, things that aren't necessarily to do with the content of what policies are passed, but things that help to guarantee that the relationship between government and citizens and other branches of government is properly arranged and that there are adequate checks and balances. And I think without dispute, almost everybody would agree that those foundational procedural rights are things that every country needs. Then, of course, there are substantive rights. And this is where it becomes a lot trickier. Because the truth of the matter is when it comes to substantive rights, often two substantive rights conflict with one another. Think, for instance, about the right to freedom of speech. You have the right to speak freely, but of course that can sometimes interfere with other people's lives, like when you incite violence against them, when you encourage someone to murder another person. And thus the right to life and the right to free speech would end up being an issue of political dispute. Now, I am personally more agnostic on most of these content-based issues. I think most of these should be determined by the democratic polity. But there are some content-based issues that are actually about people's fundamental access to the procedural rights that you might have. So for instance, I think that everybody probably deserves a foundational basic right to food, shelter, housing. And the reason why is because that's a precondition for your ability to be able to vote. You need an address to be able to vote. It's a precondition for you to be able to exercise most of those procedural rights and be a meaningful member of society who actually has the basic rights afforded to them, some ability to participate within civic society. There are other rights, like for instance, right to free speech, as I mentioned, that are much more dependent on what exactly the democratic polity is willing to accept or not. So in summation, I think really the most fundamental rights are the procedural rights, the ones that give you the ability to participate within the system, that constrain the government's power, that delineates what the government can or can't do. And that there are some substantive or content rights that are about facilitating your ability to engage with society. And that's valuable. But past that point, I think many of those other political disputes are at the end of the day just political disputes. They're things that the democratic population needs to figure out, and it's really the right of any country to make those decisions for themselves.
So there are two questions I have about those substantive rights. The first of which is that are any of these rights natural? Let's say there's a society and everybody comes together and there is consensus that they are okay with murder. Do you think that that is a just society, provided that there is consensus about it?
This is a great question. I think this touches a lot on moral philosophy and particularly meta-ethics. Is there actually an objectively morally correct or wrong answer? Now, I would say here that all of these laws are constructed by humans and all our values are constructed by us. So the fact that murder is wrong is indeed a human value. It is one that we determine because we've engaged in philosophical discussion, debate, and consideration. But at some core, there is no such thing as a natural right because all these rights are defined by people. This is actually a prominent argument in metaphysics, or meta-ethics rather. So for instance, Mackey has this argument he calls the argument from queerness. And what he says is, it'd be very bizarre if these moral facts had an objective truth to them. Almost no other facts in our reality, in our world, are moral facts that espouse a value judgment that can be true verifiably and that is just naturally true. And I think that kind of makes sense. It seems as if most of our moral judgments are indeed constructs. If you think about it, 4,000 years ago, murdering other people wasn't as serious. It happened all the time. There was global plunder, conquest, violence, all those sorts of things. That doesn't mean it's right, but it was the moral code of the time. And I actually think it would probably be quite arrogant for us to assume that we've gotten every moral truth, that we know everything that is right or wrong at this point. But what I think this all indicates is that morality is essentially something constructed by us, that there isn't some natural fact that makes any right a natural right or makes one moral system superior to the other. It is really a product of human deliberation, of human thought, and what makes our society the most just and prosperous as possible. So in short, I don't think that there are natural rights.
Then how would you respond to some of the theories that suggest that there are? For example, ones that are very reason dependent, that say that behind a veil of ignorance, people would agree to this society, and so it's justified. Or things that say, irrespective of there being rights created by consensus, there are certain things that are inherent to the human condition, like autonomy and our ability to choose, that make it incorrect or morally wrong to take those choices away from us.
I'd love to unpack both of those. So on the veil of ignorance, I would argue that the veil of ignorance is actually not about substantive rights at all. I think the veil of ignorance is about a procedural right. The veil of ignorance says if everyone consents to something, when we do not know our position in society, that thing should be true. Now, it gets applied to say, thus we have a right to X. So Rawls says everyone would consent to a society that works on minimax, that those who are most vulnerable have a decent quality of life. That's all conjecture. It's not clear whether or not all people would agree to that behind a veil of ignorance. So what I think that the power of the veil of ignorance is not any substantive right. It is actually a procedural right. That if we all agree and have consensus, then we ought to be able to have that system of government, those laws, those rules that we have to follow. Now, of course, there's another aspect to this, which is there are some rights that seem fundamental to the human condition, like autonomy. And to that, I would say, I agree that those are things that are necessary for a prosperous life. Those are good things. That's why we enshrine them as rights in most societies. But the problem here is that doesn't mean that they are natural rights. I think we can admit that there are some things that are important for human flourishing, but that doesn't mean that there is some inherent moral value out there in the universe that says this moral code is correct or this moral code is incorrect. I think really when we say this is a right that we all should have, we're saying it would be good for us to all enjoy this right. It is not to say that there is some mystical divine property out there in nature that helps to validate that one moral theory is objectively true while another is incorrect.
There are some philosophers that suggest that a law is only just when all that are affected by it can consent to it. But clearly, achieving that consensus isn't always possible. So what do you think should happen then? Should the majority be able to rule over the minority in that case when you're talking about these rights that are more contentious?
So unfortunately, I think the reality is yes. In the case that it is not a basic prerequisite right that everyone needs to be able to access society, then ultimately you have to decide between some person's rights, and obviously it's better to prioritize the majority in that circumstance. Now, I will caveat this. You still have the opportunity to move in some cases. You often still identify with many of the policies in your country. But undoubtedly, there are going to be circumstances where some people are going to be left out. And unfortunately, the reality of living in large groups in societies is that somebody will not get their preferences met. So long as those are not rights that are so important for you to be able to function and exist in society, I do think that that is ultimately a choice up for the democratic polity.
Now, a society that believes that the majoritarian rule should be prioritized can fall victim to the persecution of minorities, especially when people's decisions are based along sectarian lines. So, what safeguards can you have in place? Obviously, you say things like fundamental rights and procedural rights, but those can get gradually eroded over time too when you have a majority that doesn't care about them and a minority that does. So, how do you suggest that nations and other communities go about addressing that?
Absolutely. And really, this is the question of democratic backsliding that we've been skirting around throughout the entire podcast episode today. So, in reality, at some point, you do need to make sure that people follow the rule of law and they believe it is legitimate. It is all the things that we do to enshrine it, right? So, for instance, it's the fact that we valorize the ideals of democracy. It's the fact that we often have huge reverence and respect for the judges who make decisions in our society. That the executive knows that if they ever overstep the boundaries that exist, then they will be punished in some way by the electorate. So ultimately, it is that fundamental belief in the democratic structures that exist. It is about people having faith in it. And it's about ensuring that the different bodies actually respect one another. Now, one way that we've tried to ensure that happens is through a global rule of law, through having norms like human rights laws that universally apply to every single nation. But the truth of the matter is, of course, you still need to recognize the global rule of law. And that's especially important because the global rule of law does not have a police force, does not have an enforcement mechanism. But I think, unfortunately, we're both in the same place here, Zach, which is we're seeing a world where there's massive democratic backsliding. We wonder, how can we reverse this process? And I'll be frank, if I had the answer, I would probably be a leading political scientist. But unfortunately, I don't think I have the complete answer here.
Now back to Connie for our final question.
So, for our last question for today's episode, what are your general predictions for the trend rule of law and faith in legal institutions will follow into the future?
I think tragically enough, we're in for a rough period of time when it comes to the rule of law and faith in democracy, legal institutions, any institution really, with the rise of populism. The problem with the rule of law, for many, is that it is about limiting and constraining your power. But when you believe the politician that you've elected needs to make radical change, and that they're right, and the legal system is an obstruction, a barrier, a travesty, the deep state, then in those cases, why should we even have a rule of law? And that's the dilemma that so many countries are now finding themselves in today. That they see a political leader who they want to vest their trust in, invest their power in. But ultimately, in order to do so, they have to take away the democratic guardrails and the safety nets that help to ensure that we have a legitimate society, that they encourage governments to ignore courts, that they're fine with emergency orders that help to suspend normal legal accountability. Now, the thing that does make me somewhat optimistic, or makes me believe that this trend can actually move the other way, is actually the fact that many nations are now starting to also understand the consequences of eroding the rule of law. With global media at a peak, social media being able to demonstrate so much about the world, show us so much information, we have hundreds of case studies through history and dozens today where we can see the effects of democratic backsliding. So as much as I railed on social media as being one of the forces that leads to polarization, it's also one of the things that helps to ensure that we know what's happening in the world, that we can see the threat of democratic backsliding, and that we can be vigilant against it. So as a pessimist, I would say the next 20 years might be pretty bleak. As an optimist, I think humans can learn and that we can see patterns and that we can persist and overcome the challenges to the democratic system that are impending and already occurring.
Well, Jason, I think that answer perfectly wraps up our conversation. Thank you so much for coming on our podcast, and we are delighted to have had this insightful conversation with you.
Thank you for having me.
That's it for this episode of Soundly Said. Your co-hosts are Zach Weinberg, Connie Jin, and Serena Fan. Your producers are Solomon Zhu, Jasmine Wang, Hanglin Shu, and Melody Zhang. Special thanks to our guest speaker, Jason Xiao, and our board of advisors. Don't forget to check out our show notes on Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts for more episodes. Thank you for listening, and stay sound.